The people who speak the quietest often carry the most dangerous truths. The dinner rush at Ashford House moved with the polished rhythm of old Manhattan money. Crystal glasses clinked softly beneath golden chandeliers. Expensive watches flashed beneath tailored sleeves. Somewhere near the piano, a senator laughed too loudly at a joke nobody else found funny. And through all of it, Elena Whitmore carried bowls of soup in complete silence. She moved carefully between tables, her black uniform pressed neatly despite the 12-hour shift pulling at her shoulders. No perfume, no jewelry except a thin silver chain beneath her collar. Most customers barely noticed her. That was how she preferred it. Invisible people heard everything. Table 12 needs another bottle of Pinot. The floor manager barked as he hurried past. Elena nodded once without looking up. Her honey blonde hair was tied back in a loose knot, a few strands falling near her cheek as steam curled around her face from the tray in her hands. Outside, cold October rain streaked down the windows overlooking Lexington Avenue. Inside, warmth and wealth wrapped around the restaurant like another layer of silk. At exactly 8:14 p.m., the front doors opened again. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Conversations softened. Heads turned discreetly. Nathaniel Hayes entered the restaurant with the quiet gravity of a man accustomed to controlling rooms without raising his voice. 40 years old. Founder of Hayes Biotech. Estimated net worth somewhere near $11 billion, depending on which magazine was guessing that month. His charcoal overcoat still carried droplets of rain across the shoulders as he walked beside two sharply dressed men speaking rapid Hebrew under their breath. Elena lowered her eyes immediately and continued toward table 6. But her pace slowed slightly, just enough to listen. Mr. Hayes, the manager nearly sprinted forward, smiling too hard. Your private table is ready. Nathaniel barely nodded. Tall, controlled, silver beginning to touch the dark hair near his temples. The kind of face newspapers described as disciplined rather than handsome. He sat near the back of the restaurant beneath low amber lighting while one of the Israeli investors continued speaking quietly into a phone. Elena placed soup carefully in front of an elderly customer nearby, but her attention drifted despite herself. After the transfer authority clears, he'll never regain majority control, the investor muttered in Hebrew, believing nobody around him understood. Elena froze for half a second. The soup spoon trembled lightly against the china bowl. Then she kept moving. Her expression never changed. At the private table, Nathaniel studied several contract pages while the investors exchanged quick glances with each other. Something about the meeting felt wrong. He could sense it the way sailors sense storms before clouds appeared. But instinct was not evidence. Across the room, Elena returned to the kitchen doors and exhaled slowly. She should ignore it. Finish her shift. Go home. That was the safe choice. Her fingertips tightened around the tray. Then the investor laughed quietly again in Hebrew. Americans only hear what we let them hear. Elena closed her eyes briefly. 5 years ago, she would have answered without hesitation. 5 years ago, languages had been her life. Now they were something buried beneath uniforms and late-night subway rides. She stepped back onto the dining floor carrying another bowl of soup. Steam rose gently into the warm light as she approached Nathaniel's table. The investor leaned closer, speaking faster now. By tomorrow morning, the company belongs to us. Elena set the soup down carefully beside Nathaniel's elbow. Then, without looking directly at him, she spoke softly in perfect Hebrew. That sentence alone would make a very expensive lawsuit, sir. Silence crashed across the table. One investor nearly dropped his wine glass. Another stared at her in disbelief. Nathaniel looked up slowly. Truly looked at her for the first time all evening. And for one strange suspended moment, the entire restaurant seemed to disappear around them. Because the quiet waitress holding a tray of soup had just spoken Hebrew with the flawless precision of someone who had not merely studied the language, but lived inside it. The silence after Elena spoke felt heavier than the rain against the restaurant windows. One of the Israeli investors blinked rapidly, his confident smile disappearing so fast it almost looked painful. The older man beside him slowly lowered his wine glass onto the white tablecloth with careful fingers. Nathaniel Hayes did not move at all. He simply stared at the waitress standing beside him with steam still rising from the bowl of roasted tomato soup near his hand. Elena immediately regretted speaking. She could feel it in the sudden tightness in her chest. Invisible people survived because they stayed invisible, and yet the words had escaped before she could stop them. The investor recovered first. "Excuse me," he asked sharply in Hebrew. Elena finally lifted her eyes toward him. Calm. Still. "You said the transfer authority clause would remove his majority control by morning." She replied softly in the same language. "You assumed he could not understand you." Nathaniel's gaze shifted slowly toward the investors. The room around them continued moving again, but differently now. Slower. Curious glances drifted toward the private table. The manager near the bar looked nervous enough to spill a drink. One investor forced out a laugh. "This is a misunderstanding." Elena lowered her eyes again. "Perhaps." Her voice remained perfectly controlled. Nathaniel leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her face with unsettling focus. "You speak Hebrew fluently," he said quietly. "Not a question. A fact." Elena adjusted the tray against her hip. "Your soup will get cold, sir." She turned to leave. "Wait." The single word stopped her instantly. Nathaniel stood now, tall enough that several nearby diners looked over again. His expression remained unreadable, but there was something colder behind his gray eyes now. Calculation. Suspicion. "How long were you listening?" he asked. Elena hesitated only briefly. "Long enough." One investor rose from his chair abruptly. "Nathaniel, this is absurd. You are trusting a waitress over business partners." Nathaniel never looked away from Elena. "I have learned that people speak most honestly around those they think are beneath them." The words landed hard against the table. The younger investor shifted uncomfortably. Elena could already feel herself becoming the center of attention, and she hated it. She hated the way wealthy men suddenly became curious once intelligence appeared where they least expected it. Nathaniel stepped closer. Not threatening, just intensely focused. "Where did you learn Hebrew?" The restaurant lights reflected faintly against the silver chain near Elena's collarbone. For a moment, she said nothing. Then quietly, almost absently, she answered, "Jerusalem." One investor frowned immediately. "Your accent is not American." "Neither is yours," Elena replied before she could stop herself. The younger investor looked offended. Nathaniel almost smiled. Almost. It vanished before anyone could be certain it had been there. Across the dining room, forks slowed. Conversations softened again. People sensed tension even when they did not understand the language behind it. Nathaniel motioned toward the empty chair beside the table. "Sit down." Elena's eyes widened slightly. "I work here. For the next 5 minutes, you work for me." The statement should have sounded arrogant. Somehow it did not. That unsettled her even more. "Nathaniel," one investor interrupted carefully, "we still need to finalize the agreement tonight." Nathaniel finally turned toward them, and the warmth disappeared from his face completely. "No," he said calmly. "We do not." The silence that followed felt surgical. Precise. Dangerous in a way nobody could explain. Elena remained standing. "I should get back to my section." Nathaniel studied her another moment before speaking again, softer this time. "You corrected legal Hebrew without even looking at the contract." His eyes narrowed slightly. "That is not something people learn from language apps." Elena tightened her grip on the tray. "People learn many things when survival depends on it." Nathaniel stared at her, as if that sentence alone contained an entire hidden history. And somewhere deep beneath the noise of the restaurant, beneath the rain and silverware and quiet jazz music drifting from the piano, both of them realized the evening had already changed course in a way neither could undo. Elena should have walked away the moment the conversation ended. Instead, 10 minutes later, she found herself standing beside the espresso station, unable to stop thinking about the look in Nathaniel Hayes's eyes. It was not admiration. Men like him rarely admired anyone immediately. It was recognition. The dangerous kind. The kind powerful people felt when they discovered something valuable hidden where it should not exist. "What on earth did you say to that table?" whispered Mia, another waitress balancing 2 dessert plates beside her. Elena reached for a coffee cup without looking up. "Nothing important." Mia blinked. "The billionaire canceled a $400 million meeting after talking to you for 60 seconds. Elena remained still. Then maybe the meeting deserved to be canceled. Across the dining room, Nathaniel sat alone now. The investors had left 5 minutes earlier under tense silence and forced handshakes. One of them had attempted to smile on the way out, but his face looked pale beneath the restaurant lights. Nathaniel had not touched his soup. He simply sat there studying the contract pages spread across the table while rain continued tapping softly against the windows behind him. Elena tried not to notice how often his eyes drifted toward her. Table 12 requested another coffee, the manager muttered nervously. And Elena, try not to upset Mr. Hayes again. She almost laughed at that. Upset was not the right word. Curious men were always more dangerous than angry ones. Elena carried the coffee pot carefully through the dining room. Her shoes made almost no sound against the dark hardwood floors. Nathaniel looked up before she reached the table, as if he had sensed her approaching. Decaf? She asked quietly. Black. She poured slowly while he watched her with uncomfortable focus. Most wealthy men stared at beauty. Nathaniel stared at details. The small scar near her wrist. The precise way she folded napkins. The slight hesitation before she answered questions. Jerusalem is not a common answer from a waitress in Manhattan, he said. Elena set the coffee pot down carefully. Neither is humility from a billionaire. To her surprise, Nathaniel let out a short, quiet laugh. Real this time. It softened his face just enough to make him look younger. More human. Fair point. Elena turned to leave again. Did you mean what you said earlier? Nathaniel asked. She paused. Which part? About survival. The piano near the bar shifted into a slower jazz melody. Somewhere in the kitchen, dishes clattered softly. Elena kept her back toward him for several seconds before answering. People learn quickly when mistakes cost more than money. Nathaniel studied her profile beneath the amber light. You talk like someone who has negotiated before. Elena looked down at the untouched soup. And you listen like someone who has been lied to often. That landed harder than she intended. Nathaniel's expression changed almost invisibly. A flicker behind the eyes. She had guessed correctly. Of course she had. Men at his level survived by distrusting everyone eventually. Sit down for 1 minute, he said quietly. Elena hesitated. Every instinct told her not to. But exhaustion weakened good judgment, and there was something strangely calm about the way he asked. Not commanding, not flirtatious, simply curious. Slowly, she slid into the chair across from him. Nathaniel folded the contract papers carefully. You identified a hidden transfer clause after hearing one sentence spoken across a crowded room. His eyes narrowed slightly. That means you understand corporate legal structure, international negotiation tactics, and Hebrew dialect variations. Elena stared at the candle flickering between them. You forgot paranoia. No, Nathaniel said softly. Paranoia assumes danger without evidence. You gave me evidence. For the first time all night, Elena did not immediately answer. Outside, a taxi splashed through rainwater near the curb. Inside, the warm scent of roasted garlic and wine drifted through the restaurant. Nathaniel leaned back slightly. Who were you before this place? The question settled heavily between them. Elena's fingers tightened around the edge of the chair. Then, very slowly, she reached into the pocket of her apron searching for her order pad. A small worn notebook slipped loose instead and fell onto the table beside his hand. Both of them froze instantly, because written across the open page in neat blue ink were translation notes in Hebrew, Arabic, and English surrounding a phrase Nathaniel recognized immediately from international diplomatic briefings. The notebook remained open between them like a secret that had accidentally learned how to breathe. Nathaniel's eyes moved slowly across the handwritten pages. Hebrew annotations, Arabic phrases, diplomatic shorthand, timestamps, translation structures used by international negotiators. Elena reached for the notebook immediately, but Nathaniel's hand rested lightly against the page first. Not forceful, just enough to stop her. United Nations formatting, he said quietly. Elena's stomach tightened. You should not touch things that are not yours. Nathaniel looked up at her calmly. And you should not be serving soup in Midtown Manhattan with notes from high-level mediation briefings in your apron pocket. The candle between them flickered softly. Elena could feel the walls around her carefully built life beginning to crack. 5 years of disappearing. 5 years of becoming small on purpose. And now one careless moment threatened all of it. She slipped the notebook closed quickly and held it against her chest. I need to get back to work. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. You were not trained casually. She said nothing. Your Hebrew is regionally accurate, he continued softly. Your Arabic notes use formal diplomatic structure. And your translation markers are military-grade efficiency. Elena looked toward the kitchen as if searching for escape inside the noise of dishes and voices. You notice too much. That is how I stayed alive in business. His answer came instantly. Elena almost smiled despite herself. Almost. The manager suddenly appeared beside the table looking pale and nervous. Mr. Hayes, I sincerely apologize if there has been any issue with your service tonight. Nathaniel never took his eyes off Elena. On the contrary, Miss Whitmore may have just saved my company. The manager blinked rapidly. Excuse me? Bring her a cup of coffee, Nathaniel said calmly. She looks exhausted. Elena stared at him in disbelief. I do not need coffee. That was not a question. She should have been irritated by the arrogance hidden beneath the politeness. Instead, something about his tone felt strangely unfamiliar. Not dismissive. Not performative. He was accustomed to being obeyed, yes. But there was no cruelty in it. That made him harder to predict. The manager hurried away immediately. Nathaniel folded his hands together slowly. Who were you translating for? Elena's expression cooled instantly. That is none of your business. Perhaps. But now my business partners attempted to deceive me in a language only you understood. His gray eyes narrowed slightly. That makes you relevant. Elena looked at the rain outside the windows. Traffic lights blurred red and gold through the water, streaking down the glass. Do you know what powerful men always do? She asked quietly. Nathaniel studied her face. Enlighten me. The moment they discover someone useful, they stop seeing them as human. The words landed softly, but Nathaniel felt the weight behind them immediately. Experience. Disappointment. Maybe even grief. For several seconds neither of them spoke. The restaurant had begun emptying now. Chairs scraped softly across the floor. The pianist packed sheet music near the bar. Somewhere behind the kitchen doors, someone laughed tiredly after a long shift. Ordinary sounds. Safe sounds. Elena preferred them that way. Nathaniel finally spoke again, quieter this time. I am trying to understand why someone with your background is carrying soup for tips. Elena looked down at the silver chain resting near her collar. Because soup does not start wars. Nathaniel went still. Something shifted behind his eyes then. Not suspicion anymore. Respect. Careful and reluctant, but real. The manager returned awkwardly with coffee and placed it in front of Elena before hurrying away again. Steam curled upward between them. Elena wrapped both hands around the warm cup without drinking. Nathaniel noticed her fingers trembling slightly for the first time all evening. Not fear. Exhaustion. How many languages? He asked softly. Elena stared into the coffee. Enough to know silence is usually the safest one. Nathaniel almost answered, but his phone vibrated sharply against the table. He glanced at the screen. One message. His legal team. He opened it slowly while Elena watched the color drain almost imperceptibly from his face. Then he looked up at her again. Completely serious now. My attorneys just confirmed the transfer clause. The rain outside intensified against the glass. Elena lowered her eyes quietly. Nathaniel continued staring at her, as if the realization itself unsettled him more than the attempted deception. Because somewhere between the untouched soup and the hidden notebook and the quiet woman holding coffee with trembling hands, a billionaire who trusted almost nobody had just realized the smartest person in the room had been wearing a waitress uniform all night. Elena left the table 3 minutes later, but she could still feel Nathaniel Hayes watching her from across the restaurant. Not with the shallow curiosity of wealthy men searching for entertainment. This was different. More dangerous somehow. He was trying to solve her. The dinner crowd had nearly disappeared now. Only a few late customers remained beneath the dim chandeliers, while employees quietly reset tables for tomorrow morning. Elena carried empty wine glasses toward the kitchen with steady hands, but inside, her pulse refused to calm. You know he has not stopped staring at you for 20 minutes. Mia whispered beside the dishwasher station. Elena reached for a towel. Then he should probably blink more. Mia laughed softly before lowering her voice. Do you know who that man is? Yes. No, I mean really no. Elena dried another glass carefully. People with money always think they are more complicated than they are. But even as she said it, she knew Nathaniel was different from the others she had spent years avoiding. Most powerful men liked hearing themselves speak. Nathaniel listened instead. That made him harder to control. Across the restaurant, Nathaniel sat motionless with his phone in one hand while legal documents filled the screen. His attorneys had confirmed everything. The hidden clause would have transferred controlling authority of his company within 48 hours of signing. It was elegant, nearly invisible, exactly the kind of corporate trap sophisticated investors used when they believed greed would blind the other side. But greed had not exposed it tonight. A waitress had. Nathaniel looked toward Elena again. She moved quietly between tables beneath the amber lights, carrying dishes with the same precision she used when translating legal Hebrew. Nothing about her behavior asked for attention. If anything, she seemed determined to disappear back into ordinary life as quickly as possible. That unsettled him more than the deception itself. "Mr. Hayes?" The manager approached carefully. "We are closing in about 30 minutes if there is anything else you need." Nathaniel's eyes remained on Elena. "There is." 10 minutes later, Elena stepped into the employee hallway near the kitchen to grab her coat from the locker room. The narrow corridor smelled faintly of coffee grounds and dish soap. Exhaustion pulled heavily at her shoulders now. She opened her locker quietly, reaching for the worn gray sweater folded inside. "You disappear quickly." Nathaniel's voice came softly from the end of the hallway. Elena closed her eyes briefly before turning around. Of course he had followed her. He stood near the doorway without his overcoat now, one hand resting loosely in his pocket. The expensive suit remained perfectly pressed despite the long evening, but something about him looked less guarded away from the dining room. "This area is for employees," Elena said calmly. "Then I suppose I should apologize for trespassing." She folded her sweater slowly. Most billionaires are not familiar with apologies. Most waitresses are not former international negotiators. The silence between them stretched carefully. Neither smiled. Nathaniel stepped slightly closer, though he kept enough distance to avoid intimidation. "My security team already started looking into you." Elena's expression hardened immediately. "That was a mistake." "Probably," he admitted, "but not one I regret." She grabbed her bag from the locker. "You should." Nathaniel studied her carefully. "There are almost no records of your life before New York." Elena moved toward the exit door. "That was intentional." "Why?" She stopped walking. For a moment, only the distant sound of rain tapping against the alley door filled the hallway. Nathaniel watched her shoulders rise and fall slowly with one tired breath. Because sometimes surviving means becoming impossible to find. Nathaniel felt the weight behind those words immediately. Not drama. Not mystery for attention. Truth. Quiet and heavy. Elena reached for the door handle. "You should go home, Mr. Hayes." "Nathaniel." She looked back at him. "What? You keep calling me Mr. Hayes like I am still sitting at a negotiation table." His voice softened slightly. "After tonight, that feels strange." Elena stared at him for several seconds before answering quietly. "Nathaniel, then." Hearing his first name in her voice affected him more than it should have. No performance. No flirtation. Just simple acknowledgement. Real enough to make him unexpectedly aware of how rare honesty had become in his world. Elena opened the alley door. Cold rain-scented air swept into the hallway immediately. Before stepping outside, she paused one final time. "Be careful who you trust," she said softly without turning around. "People rarely hide traps in languages they expect you to understand." Then she disappeared into the rainy Manhattan night, leaving Nathaniel standing alone beneath fluorescent hallway lights with the strange realization that for the first time in years, the person he trusted most after a single evening was a woman whose real life he still knew absolutely nothing about. Rain covered Manhattan in silver reflections as Elena walked 6 blocks south through the cold October night. Taxi lights smeared across wet pavement. Steam rose from subway grates in soft white clouds. She kept her head down and one hand tight around the strap of her bag, while Nathaniel Hayes's voice continued replaying in her mind. "Who were you before this place?" The question unsettled her because part of her no longer knew the answer. 5 years earlier, Elena Whitmore had stood inside marble government buildings translating negotiations between diplomats who smiled while entire regions trembled beneath their decisions. Back then, every word mattered. Every misplaced sentence carried consequences. Now she carried soup to tourists and businessmen beneath warm restaurant lighting, and pretended simplicity was enough to rebuild a life. Usually it worked. Tonight it had not. Her apartment building stood on a quieter street in the Lower East Side above a laundromat and a small pharmacy that never seemed to close. Nothing luxurious. Nothing memorable. Exactly how she wanted it. Elena climbed the narrow stairs slowly, exhaustion pressing against her bones. Inside apartment 4B, the lights were still on. "You are late," her roommate Sophie called from the tiny kitchen. Elena slipped off her damp coat carefully. "Busy night." Sophie looked up from grading elementary school papers at the small table near the window. "You look like somebody died." Elena almost laughed at the accuracy hidden inside the joke. "Nobody died. Not tonight anyway." Sophie narrowed her eyes slightly. That answer was way too specific. Elena moved toward the sink, pouring herself a glass of water while city sirens echoed faintly outside. The apartment smelled like coffee and old books and lavender detergent. Safe things. Ordinary things. She had spent years building a life made entirely of ordinary things. "You remember that billionaire I told you about?" Sophie immediately straightened. "The biotech guy?" Elena nodded once. "He found out I speak Hebrew." Sophie froze mid-sip. "Elena, I know. How much did he find out?" Elena looked toward the rain-streaked window. "Enough." Silence settled across the apartment. Sophie had known Elena for 3 years and still understood only fragments of her past. Languages. Europe. Some kind of international work Elena refused to discuss. Nightmares bad enough to wake her shaking twice a month. Beyond that, she never pushed. "People like him do not let mysteries go," Sophie said softly. Elena stared into her water glass. "That is what worries me." Meanwhile, 20 blocks uptown, Nathaniel Hayes sat alone inside the back seat of his car, watching rain slide across tinted windows while a tablet glowed in his hands. His security director sat across from him reviewing files with visible confusion. "There is almost nothing," the man admitted carefully. "No significant social media presence. No previous corporate employment. No academic records beyond a community college transfer that abruptly ended 6 years ago." Nathaniel remained silent. "But," Nathaniel asked finally. The security director hesitated. "We found one archived international conference photo from Geneva 7 years ago." Nathaniel looked up immediately. A grainy photograph filled the screen. Diplomats, translators, security personnel. And standing near the edge of the frame beside a senior Middle Eastern negotiator was a younger Elena Whitmore, wearing a navy blazer and an earpiece. Calm, focused, completely different from the quiet waitress carrying soup beneath amber chandeliers. Nathaniel stared at the image for several seconds. Zoom in. The photo sharpened slightly. Elena could not have been older than 21, yet even in the blurry image there was confidence in her posture. Purpose. The expression of someone accustomed to rooms where history changed quietly behind closed doors. Nathaniel leaned back slowly. Why would someone walk away from this? The security director answered carefully. Sometimes people do not walk away voluntarily. Nathaniel's jaw tightened slightly. He remembered the exhaustion in Elena's eyes, the way her hands trembled around the coffee cup, the sentence she spoke in the hallway. Sometimes surviving means becoming impossible to find. Outside the car, Manhattan blurred with rain and neon light. Nathaniel looked at the old conference photograph one final time before locking the tablet screen dark. For years he had surrounded himself with brilliant people. Lawyers, analysts, investors, politicians. Yet somehow the most intelligent person he had met in months had been hiding inside a small restaurant pretending to be invisible. And for reasons he still could not explain, he suddenly wanted to know what kind of pain could convince someone that disappearing was safer than being extraordinary. The next morning arrived gray and cold over Manhattan. Elena stood behind the counter at Ashford House refilling sugar jars while soft jazz drifted through nearly empty breakfast tables. Her body moved automatically through routine, but her mind remained trapped in the image of Nathaniel Hayes studying that old conference photograph somewhere inside a luxury office tower. She had spent years making sure people forgot her face. One evening had undone too much already. "You are quiet today," Mia said while arranging pastries beneath the glass display. Elena forced a small smile. "That would imply I am usually loud." Mia pointed a spoon at her. "You know what I mean." Elena looked toward the front windows where pedestrians hurried through the morning drizzle carrying coffee cups and umbrellas. "I just did not sleep well." That part was true. Around 9:30, the front doors opened and a wave of cold air rolled softly through the restaurant. Elena looked up automatically. Nathaniel Hayes stepped inside alone. No assistants. No security. No expensive overcoat this time either. Only a dark charcoal sweater beneath a tailored navy coat, lightly damp from rain. Conversations lowered almost instantly as several customers recognized him. Elena felt her stomach tighten. Nathaniel noticed her immediately. Of course he did. There was something unsettling about the way his attention always found her first, no matter how crowded the room became. He walked toward the counter calmly, while Mia nearly choked beside the espresso machine. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Why is he back?" Elena kept wiping the counter. Rich people enjoy confusing hobbies. Nathaniel stopped in front of her. "Good morning." Elena nodded politely. "Mr. Hayes." "Nathaniel." She sighed quietly. "Nathaniel." Something softened briefly in his expression, hearing it again. "Do you always come back to restaurants where people expose million-dollar fraud schemes?" Elena asked. "Only when the coffee is worth it." She almost smiled before catching herself. Nathaniel noticed anyway. "I would like breakfast," he said calmly. "Then you should probably sit down like everyone else. I was hoping you would join me." Elena looked at him directly for the first time that morning. "That would be inappropriate." "Probably," he admitted. "But I am beginning to think appropriate conversations are overrated." Mia suddenly became very interested in cleaning the exact same coffee cup 3 times beside them. Elena lowered her voice. "You should not be here." Nathaniel studied her face carefully. "Because of your past?" Elena went still. The restaurant noise faded strangely around her for one suspended moment. "You investigated me." "I confirmed you existed," he corrected softly. "There is a difference." Elena folded the dish towel carefully to avoid showing emotion in her hands. "And now I am trying to understand why someone who once translated diplomatic negotiations is apologizing to customers for cold soup." His voice carried no mockery. That made it worse somehow. Elena glanced away toward the rain outside. "People change." Nathaniel remained quiet for several seconds before answering. "No. People hide." The truth of it hit harder than she expected. Elena finally looked back at him. "You should stop trying to solve me." "I am not trying to solve you." His gray eyes held hers steadily. "I am trying to understand you." Silence stretched softly between them. Somewhere near the kitchen, dishes clattered. A delivery truck rumbled past outside. Ordinary sounds again. Safe sounds. But Nathaniel Hayes, standing 3 feet away, did not feel safe at all. He felt observant in a way that reached too deeply. "You saved my company last night," he said quietly. "Most people in my world would have stayed silent and watched the contract go through." Elena looked down at the counter. "Maybe I was tired of watching intelligent people mistake arrogance for wisdom." Nathaniel let out the faintest breath of amusement. "You really do not like billionaires." "I do not dislike money," Elena replied softly. "I dislike people who think it makes them untouchable." Nathaniel nodded once, as if accepting the criticism without defense. Then, after a pause, he reached into his coat pocket and placed something gently on the counter between them. Elena looked down. Her old notebook, the one she dropped the night before. She stared at it in shock. "You forgot this," Nathaniel said quietly. Elena picked it up immediately. "You read it." "Only enough to realize you once translated ceasefire negotiations in Geneva at 21 years old." Her face lost color instantly. Nathaniel lowered his voice further. "Elena, what happened to you?" For the first time since he walked in, she looked genuinely shaken. Not because he discovered her past, but because his question carried something she had not heard in years. Concern. Elena stared at Nathaniel for several long seconds without answering. Around them, morning customers continued eating pancakes and checking emails, completely unaware that a quiet waitress beside the coffee counter suddenly felt as if her carefully hidden life had been dragged back into daylight. Concern. The word itself felt foreign coming from someone like him. Wealthy men usually asked questions to gain leverage. Nathaniel Hayes sounded like he genuinely wanted to understand the answer. That made her more uneasy than anger ever could. "Nothing happened to me," Elena said softly. Nathaniel did not move. "That is not true." She looked away first. Outside the windows, rain continued falling in thin silver lines across Manhattan sidewalks, while yellow taxis splashed through puddles near the curb. The city moved quickly around Payne. That was one reason Elena stayed here. Nobody looked too closely at broken people in New York. "You should sit down before the rest of your customers start wondering why their waitress looks ready to resign from the United Nations," Nathaniel said quietly. Despite herself, Elena let out the smallest breath of laughter. It vanished almost instantly, but Nathaniel noticed it anyway. He noticed everything. Elena glanced toward the empty booth near the back corner of the restaurant. 5 minutes, she said finally. Nathaniel followed her there without another word. The booth sat beneath a dim, hanging light away from the remaining breakfast crowd. Elena wrapped both hands around a cup of untouched coffee while Nathaniel sat across from her in calm silence. He did not rush her. That alone separated him from most powerful men she had known. 7 years ago, Elena began quietly. I worked for an international mediation team based in Geneva. Nathaniel listened carefully. I was young. Too young, honestly. But languages made people trust me quickly. Her eyes lowered toward the coffee. At first it felt meaningful. Important. The restaurant noise faded behind her voice. You believe words can save lives when you are 21. Nathaniel watched the exhaustion return slowly to her face as memories surfaced. Then what changed? Elena remained silent for several seconds. There was a negotiation in eastern Turkey involving aid corridors and civilian evacuations. Her fingers tightened slightly around the coffee cup. 3 governments. 2 private security firms. Endless meetings with men pretending morality mattered more than politics. Nathaniel's expression darkened subtly. He understood enough about international business to know how dangerous those rooms could become without anyone ever raising a weapon. I translated a verbal agreement. Elena continued softly. 1 sentence. 1 clarification about timing. Her voice grew quieter. A phrase that sounded harmless in English carried a completely different implication in regional Arabic. Nathaniel felt his chest tighten slightly. Elena stared at the steam rising from her coffee. The agreement collapsed 48 hours later. She swallowed carefully before continuing. Aid trucks never arrived where they were supposed to. Nathaniel said nothing. He sensed immediately there was more. Elena's eyes drifted toward the rain outside. My younger brother Daniel worked with one of the humanitarian teams there. Silence settled heavily between them. Nathaniel finally understood. Elena blinked once slowly, controlling her voice with visible effort. Afterward, every government blamed translation errors. Every company denied responsibility. Everyone protected themselves. Her laugh came softly this time. Empty. Amazing how many educated people suddenly forget words matter once money becomes involved. Nathaniel leaned back slightly, stunned by how calmly she spoke about something that had clearly shattered her life. So you disappeared, he said quietly. Elena nodded once. I left Geneva, changed apartments 3 times, stopped using my professional credentials. Her eyes met his steadily now. And eventually, I learned carrying soup felt safer than carrying consequences. Nathaniel looked at her differently after that. Not as a mystery anymore. Not even as an extraordinary woman hiding in plain sight. For the first time, he saw someone who had once believed intelligence and compassion could coexist in powerful rooms and had been punished for it. Elena, he said softly, what happened was not your fault. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she shook her head gently. That is what people say when they have never watched one sentence destroy a family. The booth fell silent again except for rain tapping softly against the windows. Nathaniel noticed Elena's hands trembling slightly around the coffee cup. Not weakness, memory. And in that quiet little Manhattan restaurant, surrounded by ordinary morning noise and half-empty sugar packets, a billionaire who spent his entire life trusting numbers suddenly realized human pain was far more complicated than anything money could solve. For the rest of the morning, neither of them mentioned Geneva again. Elena returned to carrying plates and refilling coffee, while Nathaniel remained in the back booth with untouched eggs growing cold on the table in front of him. But something had shifted between them now. The careful distance was still there, yet underneath it existed a strange, quiet understanding neither seemed prepared for. Around 11:05, Nathaniel's phone vibrated sharply against the table. He glanced at the screen once, and his expression hardened immediately. Business. Elena recognized the look from years of watching powerful men receive information they did not like. Nathaniel stood and walked toward the front windows, lowering his voice as he answered. Tell me exactly what happened. Elena tried not to listen. She failed anyway. How much was accessed? Pause. No. Shut down every external server immediately. His tone sharpened further. I do not care what the board thinks. Do it now. Customers near the entrance quietly looked away. Nathaniel rarely raised his voice, which somehow made the tension around him feel heavier when he did. Elena carried a tray of fresh coffee cups toward the kitchen while fragments of the conversation followed behind her. Data leak. Internal breach. Investor exposure. By the time Nathaniel ended the call, the controlled calm she associated with him had vanished completely. He stood motionless beside the rain-streaked window, jaw tight, one hand pressed against his forehead. Elena hesitated, then quietly walked toward him. What happened? Nathaniel looked surprised. She asked. One of my executive teams pushed a software integration overnight. His voice sounded colder now. The same investors from yesterday gained temporary access to internal research files before we stopped it. Elena's eyes narrowed slightly. That was fast. Nathaniel noticed the shift in her expression immediately. You think this was planned? I think people who hide traps inside contracts rarely stop at one attempt. Nathaniel exhaled slowly. My cybersecurity division is already handling it. Elena looked toward the phone still clenched in his hand. And your cybersecurity division probably believes this is only a technical problem. Nathaniel studied her carefully. You disagree? Elena lowered her voice. Manipulation works best when intelligent people become distracted by complexity. Nathaniel remained silent. Elena glanced toward the entrance to make sure nobody stood close enough to overhear. If they failed to take control legally, they may try creating panic inside the company instead. Nathaniel's eyes sharpened instantly. Destabilize investor confidence. Elena nodded once. People reveal patterns when they think strategically instead of emotionally. Nathaniel stared at her with growing disbelief. Every answer she gave sounded less like theory and more like experience. You already knew this kind of thing happens, he said quietly. Elena looked away. International negotiations and billion-dollar corporations are not as different as people imagine. Before Nathaniel could respond, his phone rang again. He answered immediately. Hayes. Silence. Then his expression changed completely. What do you mean the board called an emergency vote? Elena watched the color drain slightly from his face. Without my authorization? Another pause. Nathaniel's jaw tightened hard enough to show beneath the soft restaurant lighting. I will be there in 20 minutes. He ended the call slowly. Elena already understood. They are moving against you. Nathaniel gave a grim nod. Someone leaked enough information overnight to trigger panic among shareholders. He looked toward the rain outside. If the board removes me temporarily, those investors gain leverage before we can recover. Elena's mind moved quickly now, old instincts waking despite years spent trying to bury them. Who scheduled the vote? My chief operating officer. Nathaniel frowned slightly. Someone I have trusted for 12 years. Elena held his gaze steadily. Then he was the first person they approached. The certainty in her voice unsettled him because deep down he already feared she was right. Nathaniel looked exhausted suddenly. Not physically, spiritually. Like a man realizing success had surrounded him with polished betrayal for longer than he wanted to admit. Elena noticed it immediately. You need evidence before you walk into that room, she said softly. Nathaniel almost laughed without humor. And where exactly am I supposed to find evidence in 20 minutes? Elena glanced toward the folded legal documents still sitting inside his booth. Then slowly, carefully, she asked a question that made Nathaniel's entire expression shift. Did your investors ever send contracts in both Hebrew and English versions? Nathaniel stared at her. Yes. Elena's eyes grew colder, sharper. The waitress disappeared for a moment, replaced by the woman from Geneva. Then there is a very good chance they already told you the truth once. Nathaniel stared at Elena as if the entire restaurant had suddenly disappeared around them. Rain still tapped softly against the windows. Plates still clinked near the kitchen. Customers still spoke quietly over coffee and toast. But none of it seemed to matter anymore. Explain, he said carefully. Elena glanced toward the nearly empty dining room before stepping closer to him near the booth. People who manipulate contracts internationally almost always leave traces inside translation inconsistencies, she said softly. Especially when they believe nobody bilingual will review both versions side by side. Nathaniel frowned slightly. My legal team already reviewed the documents. Your legal team reviewed the English documents. Her voice sharpened with calm precision. That is not the same thing. Something old had awakened fully inside her now. Nathaniel could see it in the way she stood straighter, the way her words became exact instead of cautious. This was not the exhausted waitress carrying coffee anymore. This was the woman who once navigated rooms where governments hid intentions between commas. Do you still have digital copies? Elena asked. Nathaniel immediately pulled out his phone. Everything is archived. Good. Elena slid into the booth beside him before she could overthink the decision. Nathaniel opened the contract files while she scanned page after page with growing focus. Her eyes moved rapidly across Hebrew paragraphs and legal terminology while the noise of the restaurant faded around them. Nathaniel watched her in complete silence. It amazed him how quickly her entire presence changed once language entered the room. The quiet hesitation disappeared. In its place stood intelligence sharpened by years of consequence. Here, Elena said suddenly. Her finger rested against a paragraph halfway down the screen. This phrase. Nathaniel leaned closer. What about it? Elena switched smoothly between Hebrew and English. In English, the clause says Temporary Operational Advisory Authority. She tapped the Hebrew text carefully. But this wording here carries a stronger implication under Israeli commercial interpretation. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. Meaning? Elena looked directly at him. Control without immediate reversal rights. Silence. Nathaniel read the line again slowly. That alone could justify a board intervention, he realized quietly. Elena nodded once. Especially if someone inside your company coordinated timing around investor panic. Nathaniel leaned back heavily against the booth. My God. Elena continued scrolling. There is more. 20 minutes later, Nathaniel's untouched breakfast sat completely forgotten, while Elena identified 3 separate inconsistencies buried inside the multilingual contracts. Each one subtle. Each one dangerous only when combined with internal corporate pressure. Nathaniel felt something cold settle inside his chest as the pattern became undeniable. This had never been one failed deal. It had been a coordinated takeover attempt from the beginning. You just dismantled a billion-dollar strategy over coffee, he said quietly. Elena closed the files carefully. No, they dismantled themselves by assuming nobody would notice. Nathaniel stared at her for several long seconds. Come with me. Elena blinked. What? To the board meeting. She immediately shook her head. Absolutely not. Elena. No, her voice remained calm but firm. I do not belong in rooms like that anymore. Nathaniel lowered his voice. You belong there more than half the people sitting at that table. The words landed harder than he intended. Elena looked away immediately. You do not understand. Then help me understand. She stood from the booth too quickly, emotion finally breaking through the calm control she maintained all morning. Those rooms destroy people. Several customers glanced over briefly before returning to their meals. Elena lowered her voice again. Everyone speaks about ethics while calculating profit. Everyone smiles while preparing exits. You start believing intelligence can fix things until one day you realize powerful people only value truth when it benefits them. Nathaniel remained seated, watching her carefully. And yet you still warn me. Elena froze. He stood slowly now, keeping his tone soft. After everything you survived, after spending years hiding from that world, you still could not watch someone walk into a trap. His gray eyes held her steadily. That tells me your kindness survived even when your trust did not. Elena looked shaken by the sentence itself. No one had described her that way in years. Maybe ever. Nathaniel stepped closer. I am asking for your help. Not demanding. Not buying. Asking. The distinction mattered more than he realized. Elena stared at the rain sliding down the windows beside them while memories from Geneva pressed heavily against her chest. Negotiation rooms. Translators whispering into headsets. Men in expensive suits treating language like ammunition. She had sworn never to return to that life. Yet standing here beside Nathaniel Hayes, she also understood something quietly terrifying. For the first time in years, she believed someone powerful might actually listen when she spoke. Elena said yes 12 minutes later. She still was not entirely sure why. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the look in Nathaniel's eyes when he asked for help instead of control. Or maybe some stubborn part of her still believed intelligence should be used to protect people before protecting pride. Whatever the reason, by noon she sat inside the back seat of a black town car moving through rainy midtown traffic beside one of the most powerful businessmen in New York while her heartbeat refused to slow down. You can still change your mind, Nathaniel said quietly. Elena stared through the rain-covered window at crowds moving beneath umbrellas along Fifth Avenue. I have been changing my mind for 5 years. Nathaniel watched her carefully, and Elena folded her hands together in her lap. I am tired of running from rooms just because powerful men ruined the last ones. The statement settled between them heavily. Nathaniel nodded once. No speeches, no reassurance. Somehow that felt more respectful. The car stopped 20 minutes later outside Hayes Biotech Tower, a 60-story wall of glass and steel rising into the gray Manhattan sky. Elena looked up at it silently. Places like this once felt familiar. Now they felt strangely cold. Inside the lobby, everything gleamed. Marble floors, quiet elevators, employees moving quickly with tablets and security badges. Several people immediately recognized Nathaniel and hurried toward him looking tense. Then they noticed Elena walking beside him in her dark waitress uniform, and confusion flashed across nearly every face. Nathaniel ignored all of it. Boardroom, he asked sharply. A young assistant nodded nervously. They already started without you. Of course they had. Elena recognized the tactic instantly. Control the room before the strongest voice arrives. Nathaniel pressed the elevator button with calm precision, but Elena noticed the tension in his jaw. How many people are on your board? She asked softly. 9. How many truly support you? Nathaniel thought for half a second. I am no longer sure. The elevator doors closed around them. Silence filled the mirrored space as the numbers climbed higher. Elena watched city buildings disappear beneath the rising view, while old memories returned without permission. Geneva elevators. Diplomatic towers. Men rehearsing lies before meetings began. Her chest tightened slightly. Nathaniel noticed immediately. You okay? She nodded too quickly. I just forgot how cold these buildings feel. Nathaniel looked at her reflection in the elevator mirror. You do not belong here anymore if you do not want to. Elena met his eyes through the reflection. Neither do dishonest people. Yet somehow they keep getting invited. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor. Voices echoed faintly from the boardroom ahead. Sharp, defensive, political. Elena felt her instincts wake completely now. The room before her no longer looked like corporate leadership. It looked exactly like every negotiation chamber she once hated. Expensive suits hiding fear behind polished language. Nathaniel stopped outside the boardroom doors. One more chance to walk away, he said quietly. Elena adjusted the sleeves of her uniform slowly. You know what the strange thing is? What? 5 years ago, I thought intelligence alone made people powerful. She looked toward the doors. Now I think honesty terrifies them more. Nathaniel stared at her for one quiet second before opening the doors. The room fell silent instantly. 9 executives turned toward them beneath bright recessed lighting and massive windows overlooking Manhattan. Several looked relieved Nathaniel had arrived. Others looked irritated. One man near the center table paled slightly the moment he saw Elena. Nathaniel noticed immediately. Elena did too. Chief Operating Officer Daniel Mercer sat frozen beside a stack of legal folders while recognition flickered across his face too quickly to hide. Elena knew that look. Panic disguised as professionalism. Nathaniel walked calmly toward the head of the table. I apologize for being late, he said evenly. Traffic. Nobody laughed. Daniel Mercer recovered first. Nathaniel, we have serious concerns about the company's exposure after this morning's breach. Nathaniel remained standing. Interesting choice of words. Elena quietly took a seat near the far end of the room, while confused executives exchanged glances. One board member leaned toward another whispering softly. Nobody understood why a waitress sat inside a billion-dollar emergency meeting. Daniel Mercer forced a thin smile. And who exactly is she? Before Nathaniel could answer, Elena spoke calmly from across the table. The person who noticed your Hebrew contracts contained unauthorized authority transfer language before your own legal department did. Silence crashed through the boardroom. Daniel Mercer's expression changed instantly. Tiny, almost invisible, but Elena saw it clearly. Fear. And in that exact moment, she realized something terrifying. Daniel Mercer had not merely coordinated the takeover attempt. He had expected nobody intelligent enough to stop it would ever walk into the room wearing a waitress uniform. The silence inside the boardroom stretched so tightly it almost felt physical. Rain rolled softly against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, while 9 executives stared at Elena Whitmore as if reality itself had suddenly become unreliable. A waitress did not belong in rooms like this. especially not one speaking calmly about multilingual contract manipulation worth billions of dollars. Daniel Mercer recovered first. Barely. He adjusted the cuff of his suit jacket with careful fingers before forcing a thin smile across his face. "Nathaniel," he said evenly, "with all due respect, this is absurd." Nathaniel remained standing at the head of the table, one hand resting lightly against the leather chair in front of him. The Hebrew clauses were verified this morning. Daniel's smile tightened. "By her." He glanced toward Elena dismissively. "You brought a restaurant employee into a corporate governance meeting based on internet-level translation analysis?" Elena watched him quietly. No anger. No embarrassment. That unsettled Daniel more than outrage would have. Powerful men depended on emotional reactions. Calm people forced them to reveal themselves instead. One of the older board members cleared his throat nervously. "Nathaniel, perhaps we should involve certified legal translators before making accusations." Elena finally spoke again, her voice soft enough that everyone instinctively leaned closer to hear it. "I already was one." The room went still again. Daniel's expression flickered almost invisibly. Nathaniel noticed. Elena reached into her bag slowly and placed several printed pages onto the conference table. Translation comparisons, legal annotations, Hebrew commercial interpretations highlighted beside the English contracts. Every discrepancy precise. Every manipulation undeniable. "The transfer authority language here," Elena said calmly, sliding one document toward the board members, "would trigger immediate advisory oversight under Israeli commercial interpretation if investor confidence dropped below specific thresholds." She turned another page. Then this cyber breach created the appearance of instability. Another page, followed by today's emergency vote attempt. Nobody spoke. Daniel's face lost color gradually with every sentence. Nathaniel watched the board members reading the documents with growing disbelief while Elena continued quietly. This structure was not designed to destroy Hayes Biotech immediately. She folded her hands together. It was designed to weaken leadership slowly enough that shareholders would mistake manipulation for normal corporate crisis. One woman near the end of the table looked stunned. "My God!" Daniel finally stood abruptly. "This is speculation." Elena looked directly at him for the first time since entering the room. "No," she replied softly. "Speculation sounds emotional. This sounds organized." The sentence landed like glass across the room. Nathaniel remained silent, allowing the moment to unfold naturally. Daniel looked toward the board desperately now. "We are seriously allowing a waitress to influence executive decisions." Elena almost smiled then. Not mockingly. Sadly. "And there it is." Daniel frowned. "What?" Elena leaned back slightly in her chair. "The reason people like you keep underestimating danger." Her voice stayed perfectly calm. "You still think intelligence only deserves respect when it arrives wearing expensive clothing." Silence again. Heavy this time. Several board members avoided eye contact completely. Nathaniel felt something shift inside him hearing her say it aloud. Because she was right. Not just about Daniel. About entire systems. Entire industries. Daniel laughed sharply without humor. "You expect anyone here to believe you understand corporate strategy better than executives who built this company?" Elena looked at him steadily. "No. I expect them to notice you are attacking my uniform instead of disproving my evidence." The room froze completely. One older investor slowly removed his glasses and stared down at the documents in front of him. Another board member quietly closed her laptop. The atmosphere had changed now. Daniel felt it too. Panic began slipping through the polished executive mask he had worn for years. Nathaniel finally spoke. Calm. Precise. "Daniel Mercer." Every eye turned toward him immediately. "Did you or did you not authorize accelerated communication with our Israeli investors immediately after last night's contract cancellation?" Daniel hesitated 1 second too long. That was all it took. Nathaniel saw it instantly. Elena did too. Truth always lived inside hesitation before language learned how to hide it. Daniel straightened defensively. "I acted in the company's best interests." Nathaniel nodded slowly. Interesting answer. The rain outside intensified against the glass while silence swallowed the boardroom once more. Elena sat quietly near the far end of the table, still wearing her black waitress uniform beneath fluorescent executive lighting. Yet somehow she now looked more composed than every billionaire and corporate attorney surrounding her. Because for the first time in years, she was no longer hiding her intelligence to make powerful people comfortable. And deep down, every person in that room understood something uncomfortable at the exact same moment. The most dangerous person at the table had arrived carrying coffee instead of a briefcase. 3 weeks later, Manhattan finally saw sunlight again. Warm October lights spilled across Lexington Avenue, while people hurried past Ashford House, carrying coffee cups and newspapers beneath clear blue skies. Inside the restaurant, the lunch crowd moved with its usual polished rhythm. Silverware clinked softly. Waiters crossed between tables. Jazz drifted quietly from hidden speakers overhead. And near the windows, Elena Whitmore carried a bowl of soup with the same calm grace she always had. Some things had changed. Most had not. Hayes Biotech survived the takeover attempt. Daniel Mercer quietly resigned 2 days after the board meeting, while multiple internal investigations began behind closed corporate doors. The Israeli investors vanished from negotiations almost immediately once the multilingual discrepancies became public to the board. Nathaniel Hayes remained chief executive officer. Financial news channels spent days discussing the failed corporate maneuver without ever knowing the entire truth. Nobody on television mentioned the waitress. Elena preferred it that way. Table 7 asked for you specifically again, Mia whispered with a grin while balancing drink menus near the counter. Elena sighed softly. That is becoming annoying. Mia leaned closer dramatically. The billionaire biotech guy has eaten lunch here 4 times this week. Elena kept writing an order without looking up. Maybe he likes the soup. Elena. This time she smiled faintly. Real enough that Mia noticed immediately. Nathaniel sat near the same booth he always chose now. No security team. No executives. Just a dark sweater beneath his coat, and several legal folders pushed aside beside a cup of black coffee growing cold while he worked. Yet the moment Elena approached the table, he closed the folders immediately. Work could wait. Somehow she still was not used to that. You are early today, she said quietly. Nathaniel looked up at her with that same steady attention that once unsettled her. Now it only made her strangely aware of how long it had been since someone listened carefully when she spoke. Board meeting ended sooner than expected, he replied. Elena raised an eyebrow slightly. Hopefully without multilingual fraud this time. Nathaniel laughed softly under his breath. The legal department now reviews every contract in 3 languages. Elena set down his coffee refill carefully. Good. For a moment neither spoke. Sunlight warmed the windows beside them while the city moved endlessly outside. Ordinary sounds again. Safe sounds. The kind Elena once believed she would never deserve after Geneva. Nathaniel studied her quietly before speaking. I have an offer for you. Elena immediately sighed. Nathaniel, hear me out first. She folded her arms lightly. That sentence alone usually costs me peace. He smiled faintly. Hayes Biotech is funding an international ethics and translation initiative. Elena blinked once in surprise. Nathaniel continued carefully. Independent oversight. Multilingual legal verification. Humanitarian negotiation support. His gray eyes held her steadily. I want you to help build it. Elena stared at him silently. The restaurant noise faded softly around her. 5 years ago, she would have walked away immediately. Too much memory. Too much pain. But now something felt different. Not because Nathaniel offered power. Because he offered purpose without demanding she become someone else again. I do not wear suits anymore, she said quietly. Nathaniel glanced at her black waitress uniform before answering softly. I think you have already proven intelligence does not need a dress code. Elena looked down for a moment, unexpectedly emotional. Then she laughed quietly under her breath. You really do listen too carefully. Occupational hazard. Another silence settled between them. Warm this time. Comfortable. Elena finally pulled out the chair across from him and sat down slowly. No fear now. No negotiation. Just 2 people sharing quiet honesty in a small Manhattan restaurant, filled with sunlight and coffee and second chances. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment before speaking again. You know, he said softly, the strange thing is I spent years believing the smartest people in my life would arrive through boardrooms. Elena tilted her head slightly. And Nathaniel smiled. Turns out she arrived carrying soup. Elena shook her head, smiling despite herself. Outside the windows, New York continued rushing forward exactly as it always had. But inside Ashford House, something gentler remained suspended between them. Respect earned slowly, kindness returning quietly after years of silence, and the understanding that sometimes the people the world overlooks most easily are the very ones capable of changing it. Because dignity does not announce itself loudly. It speaks softly. It listens carefully. And if this story reminded you that intelligence can hide behind ordinary faces, perhaps leave a comment below about someone the world underestimated once. Sometimes the quietest people carry the strongest truths of all.